Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us on our webinar today. I'm Sonia Clark from First Pathway Partners in Johannesburg. Our head office is in Milwaukee, United States, and we are one of the largest regional centers, being one of the first 200. And we also, our chairman, Bob Kraft, is also heads of II-USA. You're welcome to go on to the II-USA website as well as the First Pathway website in terms of the project that we have for your investment. Reason for corporate governance webinar today is because it affects each and every one of us, not just personally, but our businesses. Terry's going to speak to us about what we could have done to avert not just this crisis, any economic and any future crises that we may face. As everyone knows, it's not going to be a quick fix, and Terry can help each and every one of us through the steps and guidelines to reduce the impact and also safeguard what we do going forward as organizations and companies or board directors as a board. I'm going to just give you a brief bio of Terry, just so that you know where Terry comes from. I've known Terry for over 20 years. So as you know, Terry is the CEO of the CGF Research Institute. He's an executive director and a shareholder of the company. And CGF is firmly established in South Africa and the continent at large. And the company flagship products are namely corporate governance body of knowledge and the corporate governance framework. That is all part of the Research Institute. They look at approved by subject matter. They are approved subject matter experts found within the audit, the legal and civil specialized families. So Terry has also has chaired numerous GRC events, as well also being appointed as the strategic partner to international events such as ICGN, World Climate Summit, and the Millennium Development Goals Review. And then obviously the Southern Africa Compliance Awards was also awarded to Terry. Through these recognitions, Terry forms part of an extensive international network and also recognized globally. He helps members to develop strong personal brands in order to distinguish themselves from others in their respective industries. He's a regular guest speaker at various universities, business schools, and business forums. So just to touch on the latest CGF opinion piece, Terry regularly has opinion pieces which is of value to any organization that values the framework in which corporate governance is structured. So the opinion piece basically is headed addressing debilitating risks and requirements as a robust governance framework. Okay, so he mentions in here, times we are currently living in are unprecedented. COVID-19 was once again highlighted the reasons why good governance is a critical function in a democratic country. The other part also highlighted in the opinion piece, he states here, for the most part, however, the majority of businesses in South Africa are suddenly faced by a complete loss of revenue while still having to maintain the same cost structure. It has become evident that many business strategies did not provide for alternative routes. And if I may just take another highlighted piece from here, Terry also says, however, CGF believes that these organizations who had implemented a corporate governance framework prior to the national lockdown would have been better prepared to manage their way through these types of unknown crises. Some of the topics we are going to touch, I'm going to be asking Terry on various topics that have impacted us all and what we should be doing going forward. I'm just going to jump straight through to Terry's bio. Let's have a look here in terms of additional framework in here. In these current times, being able to respond quickly to changing market conditions is a strategic differentiality. So, in saying so, I'm going to hand you over to Terry. Terry, you're welcome to introduce yourself, and then I'm going to kick straight into the questions. And the highlighted topic today is, did we understand the importance of corporate governance in business and civil society? Over to you, Terry.
Sure. Okay. Well, Sonia, to you and to your team and associates, First Pathway, thank you so much for inviting me to this particular webinar. I'm indeed honored. Yes, it's true, Sonia, we've known each other for many years, and it feels almost unbelievable thinking I've been doing this now for nearly 20 years. But I think this particular topic has a particular value to all of us, indeed, in South Africa and, of course, across the world. And the question is, could we have mitigated the risk in response to COVID had we had better controls and governance in place? And I suppose most people would say no, but we are inclined to differ with that particular opinion. And we really do believe that had organizations prepared themselves on robust, effective and efficient governance frameworks, the effects of minimizing the kind of consequences that we've seen to date would have been far less. So, Sonia, you've asked me to address a few topics in the weeks coming ahead. And this one, of course, is going to be talking about the effects of corporate governance on a business during and perhaps post-COVID. Of course, nobody's really certain when COVID and the lockdown regulations in various jurisdictions is exactly going to end. Indeed, here in South Africa, we've got 5 various phases, and I reckon that those 5 phases will be fully locked or lifted, if I can put it that way, probably only towards the end of August, September. And the question is, how will businesses locally and internationally, of course, be affected as those regulations are lifted over a period of time? In another series of talks, I've offered to speak about the understatement of corporate governance and how that affects civil society. And if it does affect civil society to the extent that we believe it does, what kind of improvement should be taken? And then the third topic that we'll cover as another series of talks in the weeks ahead is, if corporate governance is seen as a tick box exercise, should we even bother then with corporate governance? So those are going to be the 3 types of topics that we'll be covering in the weeks ahead. And today I'm going to be specifically covering corporate governance, its effects on business and, of course, society. Back to you, Sonia.
Thank you, Terry. Thank you very much for your gracious introduction. If I could just ask you, Terry, I don't know if everybody else has the same technical issue. If you could maybe just try to speak a bit louder, that'll be great. But we did get your opening. Thank you. So the first question I'd like to pose to you, Terry, is what is corporate governance in a nutshell, and how is it relevant today?
Okay, Sonia, it seems like such a simple question when you say, what is corporate governance? And in fact, it's a lot more complex and difficult and intricate, perhaps, to what we actually think about. In its most simplest term, corporate governance, in my mind, is about discipline. It's about structure. And so if one were to compare the so-called corporate governance of a business to the corporate governance of a sports club, for example, the question would be, how are you directing and controlling the business, and how are you directing and controlling a sports club? Or for that matter, if I really had to push it much harder, do you apply corporate governance in your home? So it's really about a set of rules by which an authority, in the case of business, would be the board of directors. The authority exercises its disciplines, the controls, the measures to ensure that the particular organization is being governed correctly. You would remember the words trustee. It's pretty much the same. Who are the trustees? Who are the governors? Who are the people, the fiduciaries? Who are those people that actually protect the organization? And with that then comes, what's the mechanism that you're going to use in terms of ensuring the discipline structures are in place? And that's really where the corporate governance framework comes from. You would understand that from one business to another business, in other words, two different types of businesses. Let's say one business is a mining company and the other business is a shoe company. I'm just using arbitrary examples, of course. You would understand that the rules of governing the two different organizations would clearly be quite different. Therefore, and similarly would be at home, the way in which I discipline the subjects in my home and the way that you would discipline the subjects in your home is quite different, and rightly so. The question now is how do you bring all that to bear to ensure that there's at least a measure of comparability from one organization to the next? And that's exactly where the framework comes in, is to ask, how are you actually structuring the areas of accountability, which is essentially for the board, and how are you then structuring the areas of responsibility in terms of management? And those two worlds need to come together. And that's why we say that the board ultimately is to be held accountable for its measures of mitigating risk, its measures in terms of applying oversight, and of course the management, the CEO of the organization endowmentally. How does that CEO ensure that there's proper discipline in terms of the responsibilities of which the management have to enact? So that's essentially a high level kind of an overview of corporate governance, its definition, and then how it briefly fits into a governance framework. If I might just make one more comment on the framework side. Many of us would know that frameworks, they differ from country to country, from organization to organization. And the problem is if you don't have a framework that is able to be measured on a common basis, in a common way, it becomes very difficult to see who's applying governance correctly, more robustly, and who not. And of course, on this particular point, we must make it quite clear that, particularly in business terms, is that you've got to be very careful of over-engineering or over-disciplining an organization merely for the sake of disciplining an organization. There's got to be a balance in the way in which you mitigate the risks in terms of the governing of the organization. And so that framework, in order to determine how you're balancing all these particular governance instruments, becomes very, very critical to ensuring that the board has got complete and thorough oversight of what's going on in an organization. Sonia, back to you.
Thank you, Terry. Gives us a lot to think about. I'd like to pose this question: how does corporate governance affect the risk factors? For example, when to invest and when to divest, by using pure logic and hard evidence?
Okay, Sonia, that's again a good question, because the question is, how are we determining what is a well-run company, and from a well-run company, particularly if it's a listed company, how do you know whether or not it's performing well? How do you know that the type of decisions being taken by the board are well governed, are accepted by a community, by all different types of stakeholders? How do you know that? Well, without corporate governance being discussed in a transparent way, such as, for example, looking at the company's various reports, integrated reports, annual reports, you wouldn't really know. You'd have to go almost on a bit of a blind trust, a blind faith, in terms of believing what the company has told you about its performance and how well it's performing. So the problem, of course, is that companies, by their very nature, and I'm talking specifically listed companies, whether it's in South Africa or anywhere in the world, by their very nature, they need investment in order to make sure that the operations, are being sustained and that they can grow. And so the nature of a company, the nature of the board would be to tell you that things are going really, really well, and you can trust us with your money, with your investments. The question is, how do you believe that? How do you measure that? And I would say that a number of people would kind of, look at the annual reports. They would maybe look at, the market regulator comments. They would make their own speculations, and then they would hope to help that they're making a good investment based on maybe past performances. But they wouldn't know, for example, if some poor governance was taking place at that very moment, as an example, in the organization, how such an activity or the performance of bad governance would affect share price. And ultimately, that affects the person's investments. Let me give you a good example. Let's talk about, for example, Steinhoff. And we all know the case of Steinhoff, locally and internationally. Everything seems so normal, so perfect. The auditors were doing their work, supposedly, internal auditors and external auditors. People made investments based on trust, based on what they were listening to and what they were believing in terms of what they were reading. At the end of the day, the losses around the world ran into billions of dollars. People lost their money because essentially they were not able to determine exactly what was going on. So investments are completely tied into the nature of how an organization is governed. And if you look at the new institutional informed investors, and I'm going to be a little bit controversial perhaps in saying the following thing. The youth, the young people. Let's think of Greta Thunberg as an example. We know the name. She has challenged various presidents around the world. She's challenged actors in Hollywood. She's challenged so many leaders in terms of how they're applying themselves in terms of the governing of their organizations and indeed their countries. And I would put to you that she's not particularly charmed with the responses that she's getting back. And so the question is, what kind of investor would the youth, the informed institutional investors now have if they see that an organization is not practicing good governance and is making these claims that they are good corporate citizens? Do you think the Greta Thunbergs of the world would make investment in your company? Do you think the Greta Thunbergs of the world would want to work for your company? These are all various forms of investment. Do you think they would want to buy your products if your products are genetically modified and you're claiming otherwise? In my mind, the answer is no. And so to tie into this particular question, Sonia, we really do need to understand that investment today goes well beyond the monetary investment. It goes to how people are prepared to support you. And perhaps just to close on this particular question, we often don't take into consideration our reputation and the credibility and the brand. And those all have a value. And as soon as something goes wrong in an organization, that an organization can't contain that risk, clearly it has dire implication on the investment of the organization. Sonia, back to you.
Thank you, Terry. At this point, I just want to ask everyone, if you have any questions, to please, there's a chat section on the right-hand side of the screen. I see we do have one question already. We'll get to questions and answers straight after the presentation. Thank you very much, Wilson. The next question, Terry, I'd like to also ask you how corporate governance framework assists an organization to govern and mitigate their risk. And I'm talking particularly companies outside of the US, particularly South African investors, and how you would answer not just the above question that I asked, including this one in terms of risk mitigation.
Sure, Sonia, these are tough questions. I think to start off with, let me just maybe set the scene in terms of what a risk like COVID has set for the world. This is probably one of, besides the Great Depression, this is one of the most widest and deepest risks, I think, that we've seen since the Great Depression of 1929, 1932, thereabouts. And just to put that into some kind of perspective, the kind of losses that we saw at that point in time, 1929 and 1932, it was around about 15% GDP contraction worldwide. So that's just to put something, just to put that in the back of our heads. If we look at the way in which the markets globally contracted with the 2007-2009 financial crunch, that was, the analysts are saying, roughly 1 to maybe 2% contraction worldwide. If we look at what COVID has so far done to the world economy, the analysts are saying anything between 1.5 trillion US dollars up to 4.1 trillion US dollars. So I'm just putting that into perspective so we can understand the kind of consequences to an organization or indeed a country not having the foresight in order to mitigate risk. To put that, that figure of 4 trillion US dollars into some perspective, that represents to date a 5% GDP contraction worldwide. And I'm sure there might be 1 or 2 South Africans maybe also listening to this webinar, hopefully so. And if I was to say to you the kind of impact that we're seeing so far in South Africa, and I'll bring this back to governance and I'll bring it back to risk management, the kind of contraction we're seeing on our Johannesburg Stock Exchange as of the 31st of March up until now is a contraction of around about 24.8% contraction. That's quite hectic. If you have a look at the central bank, the South African Central Bank's outlook on South Africa, so far, COVID has cost us, if I can put it into a cost term, not just the 500 billion rand, which is 10% of our annual GDP, but it's cost us so far 6.4% contraction on our GDP. Now, we don't need to be rocket scientists or financial buffs to understand that these are very significant figures and, of course, very significant times. So the first question that's got to be asked, and I can ask this question in a parallel fashion. I could compare a country to a company as though a country was a USA Inc. or a South African Inc. or Nigeria Inc., doesn't matter where it is, as an incorporate, and I can compare that to a company. So let's do that. If a company, and I'm going to just refer to a company right now, does not have a thorough understanding integrally of all its governance, risk and compliance governance elements, and I'll come to that point now, the company can't claim that it is truly in control of the organization and that it is truly exercising proper judgment and oversight. It can't make that claim. Why? Because it doesn't know what it doesn't know. So let's just quickly park that thought. Which company anywhere in the world could have accurately predicted COVID? Well, this might come as a surprise. A few did, but nobody really listened. Remember, we had SARS and we had MERS, and of course we had Bill Gates talking to us just a few years ago, warning the world that we need to get our houses, so to speak, in order. And so we didn't listen. So from a governance point of view, there are a whole number of governance elements in any organization worldwide that have to be clearly understood, indeed by the board, in order to understand how to mitigate any kind of risk, especially if that risk has the ability to debilitate the organization. Now, let's get back now to COVID. COVID in itself, we would argue, was not a black swan event. In other words, we could have seen it if we had just been alerted more, I suppose, in our respective boardrooms. So let's just say that COVID itself is not the black swan. What is the black swan is the consequences that companies across the world have suffered in terms of not being prepared. So let me get directly to the question. Can you see that as any country would write a regulation as to how a society must behave? In that society, there are businesses. So what we're telling society, and of course by implication businesses, here are a set of rules, laws, regulations that we now expect you to abide by. Those laws, rules, codes, policies, and procedures need to be factored in to the respective organization's strategic thinking as well as its operations. And if there isn't proper governance and there isn't a proper governance framework, somebody may have missed the regulations, somebody more than likely didn't codify those regulations into the organization to ensuring that the entire organization would be compliant with all the rules, the laws, and the regulations in respect of COVID. But let's just park that thinking for a minute. It's not just about COVID. It's also about every single law that the country makes in terms of having a business, running a business, understanding its implication in the supply chain. So COVID and its own laws and regulations, which vary from country to country, and there's a complexity in that in itself, all of that needs to be factored into that business. And if there's no effective, efficient way of understanding another law because another law has been produced, there's no way they're not being able to measure it in order to see how you're complying. Let me take this down to a more granular type level, and it'll make sense now. An organization will have a number of governance elements that it needs to look after. I would almost say it's a must. In other words, you don't have an option. You've got to do it by law. As soon as there is an implication on a law, in this case we'll use COVID, because that's very popular discussion right now. As soon as there is a law or a regulation in terms of COVID, the first question that needs to be asked by the board of a company or the board of the country Inc., America Inc., South Africa Inc., the company needs to ask, how does this particular law affect our codes, our policies, our procedures, as well as the overall effect it has on the strategy of a business? Important question. Equally important is, oh my gosh, employees may not come to work any longer, unless, of course, you're an essential worker. So if my employees can't come to work and they can't access their workplaces and do their normal work, how does that affect the continuity of my business? These are just very high-level thoughts quickly to answer this question. Well, did we consider business continuity management in our governance frameworks? Well, we've discovered that most organizations haven't. So whilst they may have put a paper document in to say how they will address a disruption in the business, we find out now that many organizations did not stress test those pieces of paper to see, A, are they legitimate? Will the plans actually work in the case of some sort of disaster? B, are they realistic? Are they effective? Are they efficient? So from a regulation, we spoke briefly then its implication on a code, on a policy. Then we spoke about its implication into the strategy of the organization. Then we spoke about it into the sustainability of the organization. And we've just stopped on this issue called business continuity management. And that's a debate that can run into hours, days, weeks. My final point about all of this is the following. As a board, now that we've understood the effect of COVID, not in one particular company, but COVID across the world, the issue is, with these major disruptions, do we actually have a going concern? Key question, because it's up to the board as well as the auditors of the organization, internal and external, to check how these disruptions are likely to impact the sustainability and even the viability of the organization. Most boards have not done that. A lot of them haven't done it because they haven't given governance the necessary importance to what they should have in the first place. In many cases, certainly in our experience, governance seems to be a bolt on. They bolt it on to their strategy when they have time or when there's budget or if there are sufficient resources. And clearly now, through the COVID uncertainty, you can see organizations across the world scrambling to try and regroup and obviously to save what they can save of their businesses. Perhaps as a final thought on this, not every business in the world has suffered in the same way that others have. Sure, many will close. From a South African perspective, the figures being bandied around right now is at least 1 million new people will be unemployed by the time some of the COVID is lifted. Now, we don't know when it's going to lift entirely, here and indeed across the world. To put that 1 million people into some perspective, in South African terms, what that means is 40% at least is now the figure of our unemployment rate. That's very, very high. And with that comes other consequences, increased crime and so on and so on. So it's a very complex question that is posed, and we try and simplify these questions into the implications of these types of risks, not only the COVID risk, could be any disruption to your business. We try and simplify it by looking at the organization's governance framework and asking hard questions as to the likely impact, the probability effect as well, and whether or not the organization has got sufficient robustness in terms of its documentation, its processes, its policies, in order to withstand the kind of risks that we're now seeing happening as a result of COVID. Sonia, I hope that's answered that question. Back to you.
Thank you, Terry. Yes, it answered future questions that I had, but we'll just touch on them lightly. Your view, sustainable development goals for the next 10 years, how does it correlate to South Africans and other business sectors, to South African businesses and also other business sectors, whether it be here or globally? Sorry, I think Terry's mic is off. Terry, your mic is off.
I'm back again. My apologies. I forgot to put the mic back on. Sonia, you asked some very, very tough questions, but let's try this one. The idea that an organization anywhere in the world is self-serving and that it can operate in a vacuum. That may have been the case 30, 40 years or so ago. It certainly is no longer the case. You just have to ask, top boards, top listed companies anywhere in the world, when the activists arrive at the AGMs and ask tough questions around what the company is doing for the community. And it's rather embarrassing when a company makes claims to its compliance to being a good or a decent corporate citizen. And so the compliance to being a sustainable organization and helping community, at least within the ambit of the organization, is no longer a simple response to saying, well, we've given a donation to the poor, we've given donations. Let me just leave it at that, because it's a deep subject. The issue now is, in the years gone by, we had something called what we called the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, and they were due by the world, by corporations, to talk about their compliance to the MDGs. I think they were due in around about 2012, 2013, I think it was, thereabouts. And we found that across the world, whilst many first world countries had done relatively well, in fact, very well. Let me qualify that. They've done very well with trying to meet those particular MDGs in more developing countries, Africa, India, Russia, China. Their so-called compliance to the MDGs was not as good. And so there was an index for both MDGs and, of course, now the SDGs. Which all rolls up into the GRI, the Global Responsibility Index. So how does this affect an organization? As I said at the start of this particular question, no company can foresee itself as being an island unto itself, that it doesn't need to worry about its stakeholders and indeed the outside stakeholders. It needs to worry about it. And so the SDGs, which are due in around about 2030, puts a call out to organizations worldwide to say, we require a concept of communal work, collectivity, if you will, where solidarity, if you will, where all these companies around the world all aspire to helping to create a more sustainable environment. Firstly, wherein the company itself operates, in other words, its immediate stakeholders, which starts with employees, just as a matter of interest, but that network of togetherness is extended across the world to help improve the impoverished state of millions of people who are poor, who are living on less than $2 a day. And so the SDGs, if I remember correctly, I think there's 16 or 17 of them, needs to be factored in to an organization's sustainability goals, to its corporate social values, and they need to set themselves targets. And at the end of the day, all of this is reported on an annual basis, and it's rolled up eventually to places like the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, the IMF, to see just how well a country is doing in those particular areas. So sustainability is a very deep, a very broad discussion. It goes to, for example, alleviating hunger, poverty, helping with sanitization, water, deforestation, animal rights, CITES. There's so much in that. And organizations, obviously, not that they don't need to worry about all of the goals, but some organizations may have found that they've got a greater leaning towards certain of the goals and maybe not others. And that's why when you report on these goals, we can then see where certain gaps might be missing. So if we go back to places like the World Bank or the IMF, we can then see which goals are getting more attention, which goals aren't getting more attention, and obviously then to assist in understanding where to divert future funding. So, Sonia, that would be a high-level synopsis of SDGs, sustainability. One thing I can add to this discussion, as I said, it's a very complex discussion, is the youth of today, the X, the Y, the Z generation, the millennials. They are not so focused on the component of money and money alone. You'll remember people like Greta Thunberg, 17 or so years old. Her value system, like so many millions of new young people around across the globe, they're worried about not dying of old age, but dying because the environment is polluted, that they don't have a sustainable earth on which to live. Elon Musk would talk to us a lot about that as well. So it's important that we understand how to bring these worlds together, but also how it will change an organization's strategy, because its value systems will have to change to meet the requirements of these new, young, activist, institutional investors. A deep discussion, but a very critical one, and one that needs to be factored in our boardrooms, and not just in the boardrooms, indeed across civil society. Sonia, I hope that answers that question, and back to you.
Thank you, Terry. Yes, if anybody's got questions, remember to click on the red tab on the right-hand side of your screen and send us questions. We'll address a little bit later. Terry, the next question that I've got for you, where are we sitting right now as citizens, whether it be citizens of South Africa or citizens globally, but mainly from a South African perspective, how could one prepare for future crises? I mean, we're already in a crisis, and we should be building the framework going forward in terms of mitigating those risks. What would your answer be to possibly South Africans that are either waiting to see or whether they would like to make an informed, logical decision?
Sonia, where did you get these questions from? These are tough. All right.
Yeah, that's your fault, because these are discussions we've been having over many years.
That's very true. You're well informed, Sonia. Sonia, I'm going to rather answer this question in a more generic way. And I'm going to answer it firstly, I guess, from a business perspective, and then I'm going to take it back to a citizen perspective. And I hope that what I say is going to make sense. So in business terms and in governance terms, I've touched on the idea of, an informed board being able to understand the intricacies, if you will, of how a risk affects that organization and how they need to mitigate against those risks and how they need to recalibrate, in a sense, their thinking and their strategy, such which the organization can remain viable, sustainable, and that it remains relevant. That's another important topic maybe for another time. Are we relevant is the question, as businesses, as business leaders. But the first thing we should start with at a basic level is understanding governance in terms of risk mitigation. And in the old days, we spoke about adopting lines of defense. Now, let me put this into domestic terms, maybe personal domestic terms. So if my daughter were to come home and say, Dad, I've met George, Fred, or Simperi, as it were, will you please tell me what you think of him? So I would meet Simperi or George, and I would say to my daughter privately, I think he's great. And so that kind of thinking, that process, is what we would first refer to the combined assurance process. In other words, my daughter is being given an assurance that the person that she is dating is somebody that is approved by the parent or by the friends, however it works. In business terms, the same concept applies. We need to get an understanding in terms of mitigating risk that the board, as well as the management, are assured that the organization collectively are adequately understanding and mitigating their risk. So that would be a very, very high kind of understanding of assurance, and then because there might be 2 or 3 or a whole number of parties involved, that is what I would then refer to as the combined assurance process. In business terms, the combined assurance process is not just something which is done on an internal basis, it's also done on an external basis. So if I go back to my family domestic type of example, now that my daughter has been given assurance from her parents that the boyfriend, however it were, is a great choice, her next way of assuring that the gentleman is good should probably go to her friends, or the other way around, however she chose to do it. So that's a very elementary way of explaining combined assurance in order to understand how to mitigate risk. So if I now go to the next level, the question would be, what lines of defense do you put in to ensure that you've adequately protected the assets, the company, the family structure, the family name? What's the lines of defense? In the old days, we spoke of 3 lines of defense. And I'll put it into a homely environment this now. But these 3 lines of defense are so critical, particularly for business people, to understand how well a company is being governed, or dare I say, how well a country is being governed. So let's just quickly unpack a domestic example. The lines of defense I would have in my home to protect my home and the subjects of my home. I would have a wall, a mortar brick-built wall around my house, line 1. Then I'd have no man's ground, where I've got cameras and dogs, security dogs, in the no man's land between the wall and my house. I would call that line 2. And then on my door, all my doors, I would have burglar bars. Can you see I've just described 3 lines of defense to protect my house? Well, it works exactly the same in businesses. The 3 lines of defense, in order to understand the risk, internally or externally, would then be line 1, internal management systems and controls, line 1. Line 2, how are you using internal audit to understand risk? And line 3, who from an external point of view is corroborating how well you have protected and mitigated against risk. Now that's all the basics, right? Now the question that you posed to me, Sonia, is when a new risk comes down, how could we mitigate? Well, you need to ensure that you've got the right leadership, the right structures in place, the right philosophy around risk, the right tolerance and appetite of risk, and then ensuring that lines of defense are properly and robustly implemented into the organization so to avoid a risk. Now, let me just stop. Let's not think that risk is bad, because it's not necessarily bad. Risk can, in fact, be very good. I know some of you might be saying, no, this can't make sense. We talk today of risk and opportunity. They're opposite sides, supposedly, of the same coin. If I were to say to you, put right now $100,000 on that particular company's shares, and I understood that the board was mitigating itself very, very well, and you came back to me in a week's time and said, Terry, this was the best investment I've ever made. Terry, I've just realized $1 million profit. Had I not helped you, you'd have said, Terry, $100,000, that's a big risk. So when you start to understand risk and you understand how to mitigate that risk, and I dare say that is one of the fundamental functions of a board, is to understand the oversight in the organization of various risks, and then with your tolerance or appetite of risk, to decide whether or not you're going to go for the risk or not. That's the issue. So you need to have robust frameworks, really astute business people who understand risk and are not scared of risk. They are perhaps mindful of risk, to be able to understand whether or not it's a risk you're willing to take. And similarly, in life, we take risks all the time. When we cross the road, a bus might knock you down. That's a risk as to whether or not you're going to walk across the pedestrian crossing or whether you're going to jaywalk. It's a risk because you're running late on a meeting. Besides probably the fines you'll get for doing that in New York. But the fact of the matter is, life is about risk-taking. And if you don't take that risk, the question is, have you lost on an opportunity? Now, if I bring this back into terms of countries, I ask the question of various countries, where have you actually got formalized a governance structure that all your constituencies can see how you're governing the country? Because if you can't see it, then essentially residents, investors of a country, they start losing confidence because maybe they're second guessing the leadership because nothing is being given to those people in a transparent way. To conclude on this very tough but very brief response to the question, in governance terms, and not to be confused with giving away strategic advantage, there has to be certain transparency in an organization in what the board is doing. I'm not talking about transparency in an organization's strategy. No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the transparency in how you ethically conduct yourself as a business person, as a leader, as a human being. And all these are really critical ingredients that ultimately gives this new stakeholder, this new institutional investor, this new millennial X, Y, Z generation person, the necessary confidence to stick with you, to trust in you, and I suppose to support you. Stick with you, stay with you, same thing. But if you can't show or demonstrate that, which goes beyond the mere financial value, then I'm afraid we may be losing the plot quite quickly. Sonia, back to you.
Thank you, Terry. I think you've touched on all of the highlighted topics we wanted to delve in today. If I could ask you just as a closing statement, what your message would be to South Africans or Africa in terms of corporate governance and how we could close the statement. And obviously we would be delving into a lot more topics going forward. But yes, I'm sure everybody found this very informative and could possibly have laid their concerns at rest for now. We do have one or two questions. I don't know whether you'd like me to read them out, if you can see them on your side, Terry. Terry, your mic is off.
Okay, Sonia, yes, I can see these questions. So perhaps maybe what I should do is just read these questions, and if I don't understand the questions, then perhaps we can answer these questions offline. But I do see that there's a question that's, and then I'll give a kind of a closeout statement, and then Sonia, I'm going to hand back to you, and you can close the session. So I see there's a question here from Wilson, and he says we raised $10 million US dollars to 100 million, I presume, US dollars in equity capital and speciality focus on various sectors. My company is ready to work with any investor after extensive discussion and verification. Various documents are available to determine authenticity. I will be waiting for response. So I think that is more of a statement more than it is a comment. But if I could have turned that into a question, perhaps, I think my question to that particular statement to Wilson would have been, you know, for any investor to invest in an organization, firstly, there has to be trust. And trust is synonymous to, I suppose, to being transparent and dealing with ethical people. That if you were, for example, to invest any kind of money in any type of organization, it's got to be done on the basis of, you know, a board having a reasonably applied its mind that the money that it would use in terms of an investor's funds is reasonably well mitigated. And for that to happen, the board needs to be able to give assurance to both its internal and external stakeholders. I'm specifically using the word stakeholder and not necessarily shareholder, to give the necessary kind of assurance that it's actually got its finger on the pulse of the business, including the business's supply chain. You see, there's no point in understanding how to, and I'm going to use an analogy, there's no point in understanding how to drive your car, and I use the car, the Ferrari racing car. You can drive it, you're the best driver in the world. And yet, I put you onto a racing track with a whole bunch of cowboys. I can tell you something now, they're going to crash into you. And that's the supply chain I refer to. So it's not just a question of deeply understanding the risks of an organization in order ultimately to protect an investment. But it's also about understanding the knock-on effect, the knock-on implication to an organization's supply chain, which is no doubt one of the reasons why your suppliers in many organizations worldwide have to also affirm their values to the ethical values of the company they're dealing with. And that's one of the reasons why we see that happening. So, Wilson, that would be perhaps your statement that I would have turned into a question. And a corporate governance framework is absolutely critical to giving the necessary stakeholder, shareholder assurance in the way in which they're investing in your company. That's just a brief response. To the next question or statement, I'm not sure, but let me quickly read it. Again by Wilson. He says, how can someone who is a consultant and origination director of an investment bank gets an investor to invest into my client's projects and the profits or dividends is lucrative? How can someone... I'm not quite sure, again, what the question is trying to ask, but I think I've kind of answered it in the first part of my response to the earlier statement question. One thing I will say to this particular question or statement is that in terms of an organization's integrated report, the integrated report talks of the organizations, what we call the 6 capitals, which goes beyond one of the capitals being financial capital. So today, when we talk about getting the necessary assurance, the necessary comfort that we are dealing with a credible organization and a credible board, essentially we would talk about looking at the organization's triple bottom line. That's a concept which has been around for a number of years now. And when we talk about the triple bottom line, we talk about the way in which the organization regards its compliance, if you will, its performance, if you will, its activities, to its people component, its planet component, and its profitability component. So that was the beginning of the sustainability type of discussion a number of years ago. And that was discussed extensively in a corporate governance code at the time, still very relevant, King 3 in 2009, used extensively in South Africa by listed companies as well as government organizations, and still today being referred to not only in South Africa but indeed the world as one of the very best codes of governance the world has seen, and written in very many different languages to help organizations understand governance. So we've moved a little bit beyond the triple bottom line, and we now talk about the 6 capitals. So those 6 capitals to this question become a very important question in terms of determining the trust factor for the investment of an organization and the way in which an organization itself wants to invest in another organization or indeed in another country. All right. So we use the triple bottom line concept as well as the 6 capitals: human capital, intellectual capital, financial capital, and so they continue. All right. So Wilson, I hope I have done some justice to your statement comments, and I'd be delighted, and Sonia can give you all my details, for you to contact me, and we can take this offline and we can chat by email, Skype, whatever the case might be. Right, so Sonia, I think that is my verbal response to these 2 main questions. So let me give you, before I give you my concluding thoughts, Sonia, before I give you my concluding thoughts, back to you if there are any other questions or comments from you before I probably give you some concluding thoughts. Over to you, Sonia.
Thank you, Terry. We just thank you from First Pathway Partners and also from our clients worldwide, and especially in South Africa and Africa, for your time today, your expert advice, and your global view in terms of seeing how organizations have been run, should be run, and should be run going forward based on the sound principles of corporate governance. I think we've touched on every aspect that I wanted to today. I think what we could do, if anybody is interested in hearing more about other topics, please contact me. In closing, I would just like to encourage everybody, go onto our website, www.firstpathway.com. All the information is there on what we do. The information particularly on our investment projects, they've been thoroughly vetted. They've been thoroughly sound in terms of the corporate governance framework and structures that have been put in place. You can ask us more about that in terms of the experts that we've got within our organization based in Milwaukee. And yes, Terry, I just would like to thank you again for your time. And any questions in the chat box, I've put my email address and my mobile number, and we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. We will be doing a product webinar in the next week or so, possibly 2 weeks. You will get notifications of those. There's also going to be other topical webinars in terms of foreign exchange. Yes, and anything you'd like to know about our current projects. We have a business project where you can invest your funds called Teriyaki Madness. You could actually go and have a look at that on the website, and I'd gladly go through it on a call with you in terms of how it works, how your investment is invested, and what the returns would be on that. In closing, we also have E2 projects, which we can discuss as well, you know, in terms of E2 countries, they're treaty countries that will give you access into the United States. And yes, we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. And please contact me and I'll put you in touch with Terry if you've got any more information you'd like. Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.